Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the conference. Please have your seats. We are trying to start in time. There will be other participants coming, but we can start. This is session number 11 of our conference. I would say that this is, as I promised yesterday, the best is yet to come. This is probably the purest United Nations panel. As you may remember, we imagined this conference as a triangular dialogue with academics, private sector representative in the United Nations organizations. But then we found out useful to have a sort of display window of the most representative organizations that other than those who were present in previous sessions that could speak about their experience in partnerships with the private sector. Now a bit about the title of this session. The specific context is better known by our United Nations colleagues, but for the other participants, I would like to say that this is an allusion to the report of the Secretary General Gutierrez, which is exactly called Repositioning the United Nations Development Systems to Deliver the 2030 Agenda. That was a report issued last year in two successive versions. Of course, it contains a number of action recommended actions in areas that are under the competence of the Secretary General. For our colleagues today, this is just an occasion to not to make references to that report, but to speak about how their organizations are trying to adapt to the new context that was created by the adoption of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. But I must say much to my satisfaction, because the Joint Inspection Unit is trying to create synergies, it's trying to create more interagency cooperation, it's trying to find a system-wide solution and responses to the problems of the system, so as to make the reaction of the member states more efficient. So I would only abuse my privilege as moderator to say that in this report of the Secretary General, there are already a number of excellent echoes to the recommendations that the Joint Inspection Unit itself made in the report that led to the organization of this conference. I will give you just a few examples. The Secretary General proposed 6 partnerships related work streams. One is a system-wide approach to partnership. This is an essential statement, and I think this is, if I should define in one word what was the JIU report looking for, that was the answer, system-wide approach to partnership. Secondly, if you compare the recommendations of the Joint Inspection Unit, address some of them to the Secretary General, you'll see that one refers to the integrity and the vetting system in working with the United Nations. And you'll see that the Secretary General also promised to strengthen system-wide integrity, due diligence, and risk management in that respect. And then, like us, the Secretary General goes to the issue of the Global Compact, on which we discussed a bit the previous 2 days. And the Secretary General also asked the Global Compact to consider ways to improve governance at the global level, as well as the impact and its oversight of the Global Compact local networks. That also coincides with some of our recommendations. And finally, there are other recommendations of the Secretary General, but these are precisely the echoes of our own recommendations. The Secretary General thought as well of having a sort of unique hub, a global gateway for partnerships, and intends to use the existing structure in the United Nations Secretariat, that is the United Nations Office for Partnership. But that was all I wanted to say as an introduction. Our colleagues that represent, I think at this point in time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 organizations in the United Nations system. They will speak about their own experience. I would not insist on introducing the organizations. They are widely known, but they will add whatever they wish to add about that. I would give first the floor to Bernhard Kovich, the head of Innovation Accelerator in the World Food Programme based in Rome, for those who don't know.
Actually, I think that's the wrong presentation. I'm sorry. Could you send another one last night? Anyways, I think we can already start. So my name is Bernhard Kovich. I'm the head of the World Food Programme's Innovation Accelerator. Today I want to talk about actually 3 aspects. One is just to give you a general overview about the UN Innovation Network that actually UNICEF and we as World Food Programme coordinate on behalf of other UN agencies. Then just mention about our work for what we're doing in terms of ending hunger, and then what that means in terms of approaches for private sector, as well as the innovation work that we're doing in the Innovation Accelerator. Now, those of you who are not aware of the UN Innovation Network, it's something that has been set up, originally founded by UNHCR and UNICEF, and over time, right now, it's UNICEF and WFP coordinating. Really, it's set up with 3 goals. And if the slides are coming, you'll see also a bit of something to support this, what I'm saying. But so there's 3 roles for that. One is to actually learn about the work that's already ongoing in the system, and learning how innovations can change the UN. So it's really a knowledge creation aspect. The second area is sharing knowledge. So it's sharing among UN agencies, also private sector. And the third is to connect the innovators that are existing across different innovation units in the UN. And so what has the UN Innovation Network done so far? It has been a loose network. So if you haven't heard of it, no big deal. It's essentially it's a network of practitioners. So it's not any power structure or anything, but it's really to help facilitate collaboration. For instance, recent activities include we've been creating a report on the uses of blockchain in the UN. So you can it's a public report. You can actually go there. You can download it. It's use of blockchain. There has been a comparison of innovation funds, innovation funding mechanisms in the UN system. And the last is there was actually a report on data innovation. And this is actually a very interesting example if you think about, and this brings together innovation and partnerships, because the Data Innovation Lab was essentially, instead of saying, let's create another lab, the approach we took was different. So the CEB, the Chief Executive Boards of the UN, essentially asked UNICEF and WFP to create a Data Innovation Lab. Oh yeah, here we go. Thank you. And for the Data Innovation Lab, it's a good example because it was essentially a series of, instead of setting up a new office and having people to sit in a lab, what we did is create a series of workshops with different people who lead it. So it was actually 5 workshops over a period of a bit more than a year. 6 lead agencies, so it wasn't just UNICEF and WFP, it was also other agencies like UNDP, Global Pulse, and others who took the lead for organizing each workshops, ranging from data strategy, how to set up a data innovation project, and so on. 50 pro bono experts, and you actually see 32 UN agencies and departments participated in that series of workshops. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the example partnerships, like people from companies from private sector who have lended either expertise or capabilities to actually make it happen. So you see like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, IBM, and others there. And this is really an example of how you can bring together both what private sector has to offer, the practitioners and people who are forward thinkers in the UN. And I think that's something we are actually looking towards expanding. So actually, so UNICEF and WFP, we've now actually dedicated a person to help facilitate and actually have a bit more outreach also among colleagues in the UN system. So if you are interested, please do reach out. I mean, it's like uninnovation.network. I mean, actually quite easy to remember as well. Otherwise, just seek me afterwards. I mean, we're very open to just, I mean, it's all about sharing knowledge and being able to actually also share best practice. So please do reach out in that regard. Now, let me quickly change to then how we as WFP approach the element of partnerships and also innovation towards ending hunger. Now, as Petru said, I'm not going to bore you with why we exist. Yes, we want to save lives in emergencies and also change lives sustainably afterwards. But really, what is driving all of this development for us is we know that right now we are on a path that we are actually making progress in ending hunger. Globally, in the last 20 years, we are on a curve that's actually decreasing number of hungry people globally, but how do we get to zero? And so two key aspects that we really believe in. One is partnerships with private sector, and the other one is innovation. Now, when you think about partnerships for WFP, this is really nothing new. We've done that for 15 years, and we have a very standardized process how we are dealing with private sector. And this is really something that for us is we look into, for instance, like what are the needs of the organization, what are the needs of the people, how can we work with private sector, and that could be like individuals, companies, foundations, for-profit startups, non-profit startups. I mean, we are very open to actually engaging and partnering with private sector. And there's an example of that in obviously, it has to fit our needs, and we have a very rigorous due diligence process, which actually allows us to weigh the benefits and the risks in that. So my colleague Sandy, who is sitting in the back of the room, also, if you're interested in more details about that, please talk to her, as she's the expert on that. But I think what's important that why have we done this? And we really believe that working with private sector, and yes, you can also make a profit doing good. Our process allows us to actually differentiate between whether is this a partnership that's just a pure philanthropic endeavor, or we also have avenues of contractual modalities, and maybe it ends up as being a procurement process ultimately, but that may not be called partnerships as such, but then it could be a collaboration of some sort or an alliance. Now, let me quickly talk about innovation then. On the innovation side, we do look into like frontier technologies. So it's evident when we're looking about, thinking about robotics, agri-tech, artificial intelligence, clearly it would be very presumptuous to assume that all the knowledge of the world is already inside of the UN organizations. So we do need to work with people who are knowledgeable, people who are the experts, startups, who actually have the knowledge and can drive this. So in an example, as well, my colleague from ITU on my right will say, we know that these technologies will really transform the way we can work. We already know every second person on this planet right now has internet access, and we do need to take the next step forward in actually how can we get there. And as innovation accelerator, and this we've been setting up our accelerator, a global accelerator in Munich in Germany. What we're doing, we have a small incubation function. We also run challenges. So we had about 2,000 applications globally in the last 2.5 years. That's both, it can be WFP internal teams, can be other NGOs, it can be academia teams, for-profit startups, non-profit startups, companies. We're really agnostic of where innovations are coming from. We then invite them to a 1-week innovation boot camp, as we call it in Munich. And then in our sprint program, we support them and have then an ability to actually scale them. Now, in the, In our sprint program, and this is, I think, important to, especially as we've been talking about this yesterday as well, what we're doing in 3 to 6 months, we provide up to $100,000 of cash. One of the people from my team, entrepreneurs from private sector and from developing countries, can help the teams, depending on what their needs and weaknesses are, to really make the next step change. And we also connect them to our field operations in one of the 84 countries where we work as World Food Program. We've supported over 30 projects. On the first day, I gave a presentation on, for instance, the blockchain project that we've supported. We're using, for instance, blockchain for providing e-wallets to refugees. We have been working on, for instance, like real-time data monitoring for nutrition programs, a market-based app that connects smallholder farmers to markets. It's really, we are looking for innovations that could mean the next step change. And as such, we're also collaborating with private sector on that. Just on the 30 projects that we've supported in the last 2.5 years, all of them collaborate with either a for-profit startup, a non-profit startup, or private sector. And we either, the idea can come from inside the UN, and then we matchmake with external partners, or if it's an external idea, we matchmake them with internal people. And this is really where, personally, I also see where, how can we as UN make a difference also in partnerships. We do have lots to offer, like in some cases, the connections and the networks that we've built up over essentially decades, can actually contribute to help identify and scale those innovations better. Now, that's my last slide, just to see, if you're saying, well, but you know, that all sounds like you're tinkering around with small things. Well, no, I think we've actually shown already that some things can work. So we were successful in getting funding for a core operation of our accelerator for $25 million. It's funded by the German government, which we are very grateful for. Fast Company, the startup magazine, awarded us as one of the top 10 most innovative companies worldwide in 2017 in the food sector. And the scale-up projects, out of the 30 projects, we provide $100,000 in terms of cash and the hands-on support from the accelerator. 7 of those are now what we call going into scale-up, and they raised $28 million. Now, if we're talking about like, are things going to scale? Yes, they can. So these 7 scale-ups, it's not necessarily all coming through the accelerator, but they actually raised $28 million, and there's forecast to positively impact 1 million people until the end of the year. With this, well, thank you very much, and happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. You might have this perception of the United Nations Innovation Network not being enough known, but please keep an eye on this network, because one of the recommendations made in our report on the partnership with the private sector concern the future role of the United Nations Innovation Network. And I would like to tell that once again, as I did it in public yesterday, that the Joint Inspection Unit might consider the inclusion of a new report on the innovation existing functions, units and mechanisms in the United Nations system to really make the technology bring the technology in the surface of the agenda. We are a little bit, not the United Nations system, but we as users in general, we are technology driven. It is the technology always ahead of us, and then we try to catch up. We have this duty in the United Nations system to do our best to make a useful relation with the technology, and not to be scared about the progress which is unavoidable in technologies. With that saying, I'd like to give the floor to Christopher Clark, who is the head of the Membership and Partner Relation Division in the International Telecommunication Unit. You have the floor, Chris.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So some of you may be less familiar with ITU than some of our sister agencies, which have a bigger brand, I would say. We're a technical agency specialized in telecommunications and ICT. And something that makes us perhaps a little bit unique is not only do we partner with the private sector, but we have 700 or so private sector members, and we have over 100 academia members. And so those members actually work with the member states to craft standards and best practices. And it's been that way since the inception of ITU. If you can imagine when ITU started, I mean, we realized the organization was set up in a way that it realized that the governments couldn't really do this without the private sector, and the private sector couldn't really do this without governments, because they needed to be able to have telegraph across borders, which then became telecommunications, satellites, and so on that we have today. So that kind of foundation of partnership still really frames the way we work. That said, I think ITU, like other organizations, is trying to figure out how to position itself in the new and emerging space where technology is moving much faster and businesses are operating in different ways. And so we're doing our best to be at least at the edge of the curve as much as possible, working with our private sector members. I can tell you the private sector members are often the ones pushing for change. The way, in the way we work and the activities that we do, they're pushing us into new areas. So for example, we do a summit on AI, which we brought together 20-some UN agencies, and some of the agencies that are here today participate in it. In the last few years, we've added areas of work in blockchain, digital finance, connected car, smart cities, e-health. We're working with WHO. So not only working with the private sector, but realizing that as technology and ICTs are being used across all these areas, we need to work with other agencies so that we're not going off in one corner. So with that framing, I just wanted to mention that, here I've got two different things going. I'll use your clicker. So let me start by thanking GIU for bringing some light and attention to some cloudy issues. So I know sometimes when the accountants or auditors come in, everyone freaks out. They're going to say bad things about you or whatever. But my experience with GIU has been that they help bring the issues to the fore in a way that maybe it's not that easy for you to self-criticize. The UN is not known as a place where self-critique is necessarily welcome or normal. And I think it needs to be. If we want to change, we have to ask ourselves, why am I doing it this way? And then the answer is, well, that's the way we always do it. It's in the rules, whatever. But yeah, we haven't changed the rules in 20 years. So by definition, we're out of date. So I think what the GIU has done, they did a report on ITU as well, but then they've done this report and others, and I use it a lot, actually, to help drive change in my own organization. Because then I can say, hey, look, the GIU looked at the whole system, and they came back, and these are the conclusions. And this is where the world's going, so we need to go in this direction too. So hats off to the GIU for giving us the push we need. Now, I'm just going to highlight a couple of the recommendations and what it means for me and my work, and I'm going to use not the typical wording, because they didn't mention new love triangle in the report, I can assure you. But this is just one way of framing it, so maybe it sticks in your mind. But essentially what we need is a new triangle, a love triangle, in collaboration between partnership, proc, and legal. And the reason why I say this is that traditionally the relationship between partnership and proc, or partnership and legal, has been one, if not necessarily animosity, or oh, the legal guys are going to slow me down with all these regulations and following rules. And in the end of the day, people care more about whether or not you followed the rules as opposed to if you got any results. No one ever criticizes me for saying you didn't go far enough, you didn't push enough, you didn't get the bigger thing. But man, the moment I break a rule, you are in serious trouble. So what we need to do is work with legal and proc earlier. So what I'm trying to do now is, I used to only see legal when I had an agreement, but now I meet with them all the time, and proc all the time. We're trying to figure out how do we change the rules so that you have transparency, you're following the things you're supposed to follow, but that those rules evolve. And I can't evolve the rules on my own in partnership. So if I work with proc, I work with legal, we're going to end up with some kind of framework that will be at least more innovative than what we have now. And of course, you still bump up into limits, but that's what I want to mention, is that I'm hoping that GIU in this process will help us move past the limits that we have, because it's not just my organization, it's all the organizations. The next one, recommendation number 5, they talked about Global Compact and essentially what I would call a community practice. Our colleagues in communications have this, legal, where they meet with their colleagues across the system. I learn a ton from this. And so this is not an actual picture of the community practice, but it's not that far off. And that and that no, that we get together, we exchange, we enjoy one another's company, but we're learning from one another. And every time I meet with one of these colleagues, I learn something new. I mean, I was learning new things just in the 5 minutes before we started talking about how the other agencies are working that I can take back to my own. So I think this is really essential, because you want to be talking to the other colleagues that are experiencing the same kind of barriers and so on, and the same challenges that you are, and to learn from one another. And I would like to mention the important role of the Global Compact here, that they've really helped connect me with my peers. And most recently on the area due diligence, we were struggling internally on how to deal with due diligence and how to minimize risk and so on, which leads me to the next one. And the Global Compact really played an important role. So the recommendation on common vetting system, because it only takes, it only takes one bad relationship. So someone that starts out looking like they might be Prince Charming, they could turn out to be Dr. Evil. And so you could spend so much time trying to build all these great relationships and all these great partnerships, and you have one bad project, and then the management just shuts the whole thing down, because we're naturally risk adverse as institutions. We're not startups, you know. We're not rewarded for constantly going out and trying a big risk and fail and then try another thing. That's not part of the culture. There's a due diligence. You got to know who you're working with. We have the most important thing I always say for ITU and the UN is the brand. The brand that we're a neutral organization, that, the member states can count on us to give them advice that's not driven by one company's interest or another, or by one region's interest or another, or by the country that I come from. And the thing is if you go do a project where you work with the wrong player, it's going to blow the whole thing up. So we're spending a lot of effort right now on learning how to do better due diligence, but working with colleagues across the system. And the UN Global Compact recently did a kind of a joint procurement, I guess you could say, of due diligence services that were all, so first of all, they analyzed all the players, and then everyone gave their advice, and then we picked a few, and we're now doing that together. So that was really essential, and this was a recommendation from the report. Now, what's our objective? So I hear all the time, we talk about scalability and sustainability. We want to go from small stuff to big stuff. The question I have is, are we talking about big projects or big impact? Because my sense is we talk a lot about big projects. We don't talk a lot about big impact, which means that if you move towards big impact, then you probably have to change the way you measure your outcomes, for example. And I have examples at ITU, for example, where we actually had relatively small projects, but in my view had the biggest impact of almost anything that we've done. The problem is we didn't measure it, because it's not the way we measure. We measure what happened in the project. But for example, if we had a project where we worked with countries in Africa to harmonize their legal systems and regulation in telecom. Some of those countries after experienced billions of dollars in investment. And you see mobile everywhere now. So how do you measure that? No one really draws that back to the project. Maybe it was a couple consultants that went in a country for 2 months and helped them make the changes. So that could have a bigger impact than a $50 million or $100 million project. So I'd like to put that out in our discussions. What are we trying to do? Is it scale up the project or scale up the impact? And speaking frankly, I think we're not terribly equipped to deal with market development. If you want to scale, you probably got to, depends, I mean, we talked about humanitarian as a different space. But for example, in our area, market development and technology and innovation and co-creation, these are the kind of things that we have to help stimulate so that it will, if we're not there, that there's still something happening, that the system is growing on its own, that there are players in the ecosystem that are all getting benefit and they keep it moving. But it raises issues around competition. What's the role of the UN? Why do you work with one player and not another player? How do you extract yourself at some point? So you don't want the players on the ground to be dependent on you. So you want there to be a healthy ecosystem after. And then the issue of IP. I've seen some fascinating projects, UNHCR and others, where they're co-creating technology with the private sector, but then we struggle with who owns it after and so on. So these are some big issues I think we need to deal with. I'm not suggesting we hit the panic button. But I do think we have to deal with them. Now, I just put this up here. I found this interesting. So, either the UN is prepared or we are unprepared. It's up to us, really. So we can either be unprepared or the UN is prepared. And so I think the JIU is helping us move in the right direction to be prepared. What I suggest is we need a rethink. following up on the report. One is the PROC and partnership and the role of legal. I didn't mention there, but legal as well. To help define what is the role in the UN in projects, market development, in tech and innovation now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. I hope that our technicians properly recorded this statement because it is one that I would have liked to share with our 28 participating organizations other than those present here, because it is the first time I hear publicly a sort of frank and comprehensive view on the actual role of the Joint Inspection Unit. I think I would also suggest to my colleague to change the current boring slogan of your more effectiveness, more efficiency with this, the push you need. That is would be known and attributed to Chris. Thank you very much, Chris, for this. And one special thing about that, and I have to be frank about this, it is very rare that we hear statements from representative of individual organizations that have a vision, a system-wide vision, and that I'm glad that Chris perceived that importance of system-wide action. There will be a discussion at the end of the panel. The lady who asked for the floor. So there will be a discussion, a question and answer session. Okay, so I would, at this point, kindly give the floor to Marina Skuric-Prodanovic, who is the head of the System-Wide Approaches and Practices section in the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs. You could see in the program, the printed program, that she's designated officer in charge. So you may interpret that the very participation in this conference led to the promotion of Marina, to whom I give the floor.
Not quite, but let's just say it is this way. So first of all, thank you for inviting us here. Maybe just a very short introduction of what OCHA does. As most of you know, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, known as OCHA, contributes to principled and effective humanitarian response through coordination, advocacy, policy, information management, humanitarian financing. So when I will talk today about private sector engagement and how we see public-private partnerships. I will be probably nowhere as witty, and I don't have witty slides as Chris did, but I'd like to sort of center my presentation around 5 key points. But before I start, I actually do want to be the second member of the fan club of this GRU report, because you know, GRU reports are not necessarily something we always wax lyrical about, but this GRU report is truly very, very practical, and I think speaks to many of us. And it certainly speaks to what we have been doing and what we think about private sector engagement in OCHA, and how we think that there are certain changes that need to occur system-wide. So I really want to compliment colleagues who worked on it, because it speaks to the many needs that exist. So I'll talk about 5 things, 3 S's and 2 C's. So the first S is shifts and systems. So for us, if you look at humanitarian action, and we approach, obviously, because we focus, our mandate is centered around humanitarian action. When you look at where we were 20 years ago in terms of private sector engagement, there's a certain purity in humanitarian action, which is very concerned about anyone who's not defined strictly as a humanitarian act of getting involved in humanitarian action. So 20 years ago, we did not engage the private sector. 10 years ago, we started engaging the private sector. Now we actually realize the private sector is a very important actor. However, for us, what defines it is really humanitarian principles that need to be applied in all of such cases, in addition to the usual exclusionary, discretionary criteria that we use as United Nations entities in terms of engaging the private sector. So I think there's been a huge mind shift in how we approach the private sector and partnerships with the private sector, which is great. But the mind shift has not been followed by a shift in systems. So that S of the shift really needs to happen. And usually it's systems and principles and policy that changes, and then you have the mind shift. I think what's happened in many cases is that all of us have realized that actually private sector is such an important actor. but changing the system takes a long time. And this is where you as member states can actually help us shift the system and help us shift this attitude that Chris has also talked about risk-taking. The system does not reward risk-taking, and engaging with the private sector sometimes does actually involve risk-taking. And that's really important because innovation is about risk-taking. You will very rarely achieve innovation without taking risks. And so I think we need to have a bit of an expanded space to be able to operate in. That was my first S. The second S is speed and sudden onset. So for us in humanitarian action, what happens is that we have a very compressed, usually, timeline in which we engage. So we don't have necessarily always the luxury of time, of thinking through things, of months of developing relationships. We often have a sudden onset crisis, so we either have a volcano eruption or an earthquake. We deploy teams within 48 hours to the scene, and suddenly, there are different actors there, and it may be a context where we've worked before, it may be a context where we've never been before. And the private sector is usually there, because the private sector was there before the emergency, and stayed during the emergency, and it will stay there after the emergency. So for us, Chris was talking about the love triangle. I like to think about our approach in terms of sudden onset as a bit of a speed dating thing. You really have to decide in a very quick, in a very short space of time, is this the person you're actually going to engage in? Is this the partnership you're going to have for at least a sort of a limited amount of time? The situation with long protracted crisis is slightly different, because obviously there we have different contexts. And here we find that, there is some hesitation on the private sector in engaging in these contexts, and that's one of the difficulties, and it's one that's not always present in a development context. So, for example, we would have situations where we have no government, or a government in exile, or territories under control of a government, or territories not under control of a government. And that actually makes the private sector a little skittish. And so the way of engaging the private sector is actually different. So we have different modes of engagement. Then we go to the 3 C's. First is the collective. So in OCHA, perhaps unsurprisingly, because our mandate is all about coordination and is about making sure that we're synchronized, that we actually make sure that people are efficient in how humanitarian response is being provided. For us, collective action is really critical. And the way we're engaging, at least on behalf of the system, or things that are of benefit to the system, we believe that engaging with networks, associations, is really the most effective way of operating. So I'll give you 2 examples. The first example is something which we think is very exciting. It's one of the initiatives we launched 2 years ago together with the UNDP. And it's called the Connecting Business Initiative. And what it does, it engages networks, national networks, in before crisis, during crisis, and after crisis. And it makes sure that these networks are plugged in to whatever's happening in the humanitarian architecture. And so why is this important? Because the networks bring experience that often humanitarians don't have. They help us also prepare communities in different ways. They actually have a business interest in actually being engaged, because that means that the communities they operate in will recover much faster. And we think this is one of the modes of engagement that works really well. We've seen it work really well in places like Madagascar, Philippines, and so on. So we currently have 13 networks, and this is something we're expanding. It also works at a global level. But certainly, it's helped us also respond to what the private sector has said to us during the World Humanitarian Summit, for those of you who remembered, which happened in 2016, where we conducted consultations out to the private sector. What do you need? How can we get you engaged in humanitarian action? And what they said to us, we need a platform, we need to understand the architecture, we're too confused by too many people approaching us. We have multiple UN agencies, multiple humanitarian agencies, we don't understand it. Please simplify it. And so this creation of this engagement with the networks really drives some of the thinking that we have around private sector engagement. The second is industry-wide coordination. So for example, we engage, one of our partnerships is with GSMA, the Association of Mobile Network Providers, and what it does is we have an agreement on how they will react. It's now, I think, over 138 countries. where in the case of a disaster, a mobile phone company will immediately provide certain things such as free of charge SMSs for people who engage, who are affected by disasters, will provide wider broadband. So this is something that will benefit everyone, humanitarian organizations, people affected by disasters. And this is an example of a great collective partnership. The two other C's are coordination and collaboration. And, you know, unsurprisingly, I'm from OCHA. What am I going to talk about coordination? But we really see the benefits of this. Coordination is so inherent in not only what we do, but how we see actually humanitarian action being delivered. And this is where so many of the recommendations of this report about coordination, enhancing some of the, Chris was talking about the communities of practice. I'm not quite sure I look like the person in the community of practice, but I'll take that with some, with a grain of salt. But this community of practice is really great. And I think what the Global Compact has been doing is really important. We also have found, we established a few years ago a sort of slightly smaller, more focused community of practice on humanitarian action, because we find there are specific circumstances where we really need to act very fast and get together and decide what are we doing in some of the large-scale disasters. And that collaboration between the private sector and the public sector is really critical. It's also about getting to know each other and understanding each other's motivations. And so all of this really to say that I think if I was to pick out a number of recommendations that I really like from the Gerry report that really speak to us, one is the coordination, the communities of practice, the due diligence, which is really critical, and the need for innovation. And absolutely we need to revise the guidelines on public-private partnerships, which are, you know, now outdated. The world is moving fast, and we actually need to make sure that the guidelines we have and that guide our work are really up to date. Final plug, I know I've been talking for a while and there are other speakers. We've created we published the business case, which is a study of private sector engagement in humanitarian action. There are copies on the back table. And I think if you're interested in what motivates the private sector in getting engaged in the in humanitarian action, you know, this actually gives some really interesting, I think, insights in how companies think, what drives them. You know, why would MasterCard be interested in Yemen? Why would DHL be interested in helping in a disaster? Motivations are very different, but no less important. So I invite you to pick up a copy at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, in particular for the echoes to the Joint Inspection Unit report recommendations. And indeed, this is all the more valid and important for us as you in itself deal with essentially with the coordination of humanitarian affairs system-wide and planet-wide. While coordination is probably the middle name of the Joint Inspection Unit, is the first name of OCHA, and I think indeed in terms of coordination there is a long history behind your current mandate configuration and job across the system in humanitarian affairs. And also your remarks are important as you are very close to the community and whatever you do. So you know that there is a need of a reciprocity in working with partners. In our case, if we are talking about the private sector, we try to understand the specific of the private sector, but the private sector also should try harder to understand how we work and what are the values that we are serving. With that said, I'd give the floor to Virpi, Stucki, Business Partnership Officers in the UNIDO, Vienna United Nations Industrial Development Organization. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. UNIDO has a mandate to develop industry in an inclusive and sustainable way. Can I have the... Yeah. And as of today, we have our own SDG, which is number 9 on industrial development. Before I start, I wanted to ask, does anyone know how big of a share of the gross domestic product of a country normally comes from the private sector? Anyone an idea? Who think it's below 50%? Who think it's above 50%? Yes, you are right. So normally in developed countries is over 80, and in developing countries is more like 50%. But having said that, the role of private sector is very, very important in development, especially in economic development, and I would like to congratulate the organizers of the conference to pick up such an important theme. I would also like to join the fan club of GIU, because I'm also using your report as ammunition inside the organization. I think it pointed out very important items. So I'm going to talk about the UNIDO's role to work with the private sector within the UN architecture. Then I'm going to talk about how we work with the private sector at the strategic and at the operational level. The current industrial trends are pretty challenging. So we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution. Sometimes it's referred to Industry 4.0. No one really knows what this means in terms of jobs, in terms of technology. The only thing we do know is that the private sector is the one who is leading this development. So I can only tell what the previous speakers have told already, but we definitely need to work as UN agency and as UNIDO with the private sector. We also have experienced how commercially viable partnerships have the potential to create better development results. And now I'm talking about the sustainability and scalability. We have actually experienced this. And then as the UN agency with the Industrial Development Mandate and the Sustainable Development Goal 9, UNIDO is the private sector UN agency or the natural partner to work with the private sector. Now going into how we work at the strategic level, UNIDO has a new business model called Program for Country Partnership, or PCP. And a PCP has three kind of factors. It is selective in approach, so we don't work with every country, but selected countries. We work on those industrial sectors that has the potential for high industrial growth. The national government is in the driving seat, and the whole role of UNIDO is to leverage additional investment to achieve larger impact. And this is our way to take concrete action on partnership, which was reflected in the UN repositioning report. And then in concrete terms, we work with the private sector in projects mostly. And I'm just going to give very briefly 3 examples. Those of you who were here on Tuesday heard about the partnership with Argor Heraus, the Swiss refinery company, where UNIDO works with artisanal gold mining and reduction of mercury. So I'm not going to talk more about that because I'm sure you all heard of this example. The second one is working on coffee value chain in Ethiopia, focusing on both production and processing aspects. And this is part of the PCP action. And then basically we work in Ethiopia with Ili Cafe, showing that the impact for the companies that they know their producers, and for UNIDO is the increasing income for small-scale farmers. And then finally, in Tunisia, where we work with small and medium-sized companies on entrepreneurship development with HP Foundation and HP Corporation to create new jobs. So these are the concrete examples I can tell. I mean, UNIDO works currently with 66 business sector entities, varies from multinationals like Volvo and Scania to small SMEs from South Africa. And if you want to know more about UNIDO's work with the business sector or private sector, we have a LinkedIn page which is under the UNIDO main page, where we post everything, whether it's a procurement opportunity or partnership opportunity. And you are welcome to follow us on LinkedIn.
Thank you very much, Virpi. Indeed, I think UNIDO has a very, very heavy responsibility in dealing with this goal of reindustrialization. I think this is to some extent, this is a very sensitive issue, because reindustrialization, it doesn't mean only recreating the way we see the role of this sector in the economic lives of countries, but also to see the negative consequences of past policies in industrializations in many countries. So that is a very sensitive and difficult job, and I thank you for your insights. We are moving now to UNICEF. I will make a politically incorrect statement about UNICEF. UNICEF among the UN family is what we can call it rich and famous. UNICEF is probably one of the most visible organizations in the system. Then I'm telling that based on my own experience. I visited in early 90s countries in disaster areas in where in particular former Soviet republics, and when we opened the mouth to say United Nations, they translated immediately into UNICEF, because UNICEF was there, visible, with deliverables, with the beneficiary being our children. I also remember a moment when we celebrated the 50th anniversary in New York with a resolution in the General Assembly. We had a group of South Korean delegates of a certain age, all of them, and they said that the fact that they are alive is because of the help of UNICEF. They alluded to their childhood during the Korean War. So I give the floor to Marilena Viviani, Director of the Geneva Liaison Office, Public Partnership Divisions in UNICEF.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I think after such a kind introduction, I'm very humble. And I hope I will be up to your expectations, and also to the expectations of the distinguished participants here. And maybe just to say that you say we're rich and famous, and we only count on voluntary contributions. So maybe we need to be a bit famous in order to get rich. And we are also rich because we are famous, but it's not important what we do. The important is what children needs and rights are, and how we can work all together, because the challenge is very big and goes much beyond the mandate of UNICEF. And also, I would like to thank you for the GIU report and for the inclusive process. We appreciated that sometimes the comments from UNICEF, because of the mandate, may be a bit stronger, and we appreciated that you were able to include them in your report. And also we want to thank the World Association for Sustainable Development for inviting us, and all the co-sponsors. We are very pleased to contribute to this discussion today, and also to reaffirm the UNICEF commitment to the Agenda 2030, and to clarify that for us the Agenda 2030, and we heard this also from the other distinguished colleagues here, it's not just the SDGs, it's of course the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the Financing for Development, the agenda from Addis Abeba, and the Agenda for Humanity, the World Humanitarian Summit, as also the colleague from OCHA has mentioned. So everything I will say, we would like to keep it in this broader context of the commitments and the need we have to work in partnerships with the governments, but also with all other partners and communities, including children and young people themselves. And we need to strengthen policies to reach all children. And the biggest challenge for us is to reach those who are the most disadvantaged, those they call the hardest to reach, to look at the barriers also that do not let us address these children and how we can overcome them. So I will highlight 3 main points. I don't have a PowerPoint, but you will hear me this a few times today stressing these points. The first one is the critical role of children and young people in the Agenda 2030 and for stable and productive societies. The second point is how to address the financing gaps for children's priorities and the role of the private sector. And the third is the key role of partnerships, including among UN agencies, to advance the child and the youth agenda as a matter of common concern. So I will not just speak about UNICEF, but we have also some examples later if there are questions. So the first one is on the critical role of children, also for stable and productive societies. We know that children this time were consulted in the development of the Agenda 2030 in the States, and it became a clear reaffirmed right that children and young people should participate in matters that affect their lives in the context of sustainable development. There is language on this in the Agenda 2030, and this is a major advancement because in the past, children and young people were mainly considered beneficiaries of development and not key actors. So this was already an important part in the process so that they became part of the consultations. But now the challenge is how can they be involved as an integral part in the implementation of the SDGs, including in embracing the values and principles. It's not just to reap the dividends of economic growth, but to really have an agenda for humanity that involves all members of the society, starting from the youngest ones. From UNICEF, we made a strong commitment to that in our new strategic plan, which has been approved by the board last year, is a plan for 2018-2021. And it really puts at the basis an inclusive and meaningful participation of children and young people in decisions that affect them and in the operationalization of the SDGs. We have specific partnerships in this area. For example, the world's largest lesson, which is a global initiative that aims at bringing the SDGs to the classrooms, to the schools, to the children, also using informal ways of communication like the comics, the videos, the lessons. And we have already reached millions of children through that in more than 160 countries. We have also specific partnerships in many countries. For instance, I could just refer to the one on the Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa and in Botswana, quite active, and using mobile phone companies like the African Monitor and the Orange Botswana, where through these tools we were able to involve thousands of children in the monitoring of the SDGs and in the national reviews of the NDGs, just to give you some concrete examples on how we can work with business to give these opportunities to young people. But apart from the participation, it is also important to invest in children for a powerful economic case. Of course, children are holders of rights. This is the most important part of our work. First and foremost, we should invest in children because they are holders of key rights for social services. But if we go a bit beyond that, we can also see that we can empower them to have a strongest role as members of a productive societies. We know that ending the SDG 1 the ending the poverty, the SDG 1, cannot be reached without a strong emphasis on children. We know from research that investing on early childhood has a huge return. And investing in early education in Africa can have a return of 50%. And in terms of funds, it's $33 for every dollar spent. And this is economic investment. We know also that by reducing child deaths by just 5%, to mothers with low levels of education can result in almost 8% increase in the GDP per capita in 10 years. So this is also a strong argument for us to work on economic growth. And of course, it also helps to alleviate suffering for children and for the communities and to build the talent for tomorrow. So evolution of children into productive members of future societies requires investment into human capital. And this is a key factor, starting from early childhood. Latest developments of neuroscience suggest that children must have adequate nutrition, safe and healthy environments, and sufficient stimulation and learning, because these are critical factors from their brain development. So, investing in children and young people is a key factor, and it's also a key priority in the context of the demographic change. If we want to turn the demographic changes, such as the youth bulge, into opportunities for achieving inclusive development of societies, there is need for continuing investment of children throughout their life cycle, in the adolescent phase, and also in the later stage of youth. And I'm sure my colleague here, Monica from UNFPA, will also develop that. The second point is the financing gaps and the need to work with the private sector. We know that despite the clear returns that we just mentioned, generated by investment in children, the financing gaps remain very large. 385 million children were estimated to live in extreme poverty in 2016, and children are more than twice as likely to be living in households in extreme poverty. Demographic shifts present low-income countries with future growth opportunities, but also pose significant risks of youth unemployment, reduced social mobility, increased inequalities, and community instabilities if appropriate investments targeting the most disadvantaged are not made. And a special effort should be made to address the challenges faced by almost 50 million children living in humanitarian crisis. To cope with the above, innovative financing mechanisms have emerged in the recent years to mobilize additional resources for development, to achieve operational efficiencies and savings, and enable desired programmatic results. And UNICEF, in this regard, is undertaking an organization-wide approach for engaging in innovative financing to enhance the efficiency of financial flows by reducing delivery time and cost, including for emergencies and crises, which take us also to the important element of the discussion on innovative spending. We have also some examples on that in case there are questions later from the floor. But we know that investing in the SDGs will require much more than money. Funds are important. We heard this also from the distinguished chair. But we need to build strong partnerships, including with the public and the private partners and among the UN, to prioritize spending and investment for children based on evidence, research, and policies in order to leave no one behind. The last point I would like to make is on a call for partnerships and the UN synergies with focus on children. We think it is really important to engage all children and young people in empowering them in implementing the SDGs as part of the coalitions that we need to create with all stakeholders. And in this regard, we can also elaborate this later. We are building a new coalition of young people, and we work very closely with UNDP, UNICEF, and UN Women, and UNFPA to in this regard. So these are the three messages I hope we were able to share today. We have more examples on privacy with the private sector that we can share later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Indeed, UNICEF has a very, very complex structure of working with the private sector, an institutionalized one, an efficient one, and very often UNICEF is taken as an example. And of course, Marilena, I take your point that to become rich, you have to be first famous. So let's do our best. We move to UNFPA. I think one of the ways that people should, people that who really wants to understand the history of the United Nations is the meaning of the United Nations should look into the past. I remember vividly one of the precursors of the World Global Summits organized by the United Nations. It was in 1974, and there was this first global conference on population in Bucharest, my country of origin. And in '74, there was the divisive issue of the time was family planning. It was a concept that actually created a very vivid controversy in the international community. It was a notion that announced a sort of revolution in the demography all over the world. But of course, so the current mandate of UNFPA has something to do also with the past of this issue. But about the actual and the current main concern of UNFPA, I give the floor to Monica Ferro, the chief of the UNFPA office in Geneva. You have the floor, Monica.
Good morning, all. Let me start by thanking not only the contextualization that was just made on our mandate. We're actually, UNFPA is turning 50 next year, so we are quite proud of it. And our mandate, which is more aligned with one of the global conferences on population and development, the Cairo 1994 conference, is going to turn 25 next year. And although we've made it what we call a perpetual agenda, because we know that the goals that we set in 1994, they will never be reached. They are always ahead of us, although we try and we strive to get there. It's something that really makes us proud to keep on working for women, girls, and adolescents, and delivering for them when it comes to their sexual rights and to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. But let me start by thanking the World Association for Sustainable Development and the Joint Inspection Unit and all the co-sponsors for having us here. And I would like to say that for us, we see this new document, the new Joint Inspection Unit document, as a great platform for renewed engagement between the private sector and the UN. We know that there's been a parallel evolution. We've heard about it. The private sector is more consistent, but also the UN is more mature in working with the private sector, and we both need to be self-critic when it comes to understanding the limits and the benefits of this relation. I'm going to talk a little bit about how UNFPA positions itself when it comes to partnerships and give a couple of examples, concrete examples on our partnerships. Okay. We are, as we all know, the UN Reproductive Health and Rights Agency. This means that our mandate is to ensure reproductive rights for all, and that we work every day to deliver a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. Of course, this means that we are fully aligned with the SDGs. We recognize that our main core is SDG 3 and 5, but we recognize the leveraging power of almost all SDGs, and we recognize that our work has an impact on 3 and 5, but also an impact on the other SDGs and on delivering for the overall agenda, with a focus on leaving no one behind, which is actually something very curious, because when people ask me, why is UNFPA always talking about women, girls, adolescents, youth, I always tell them, because those are the ones who've been left the furthest behind. So if we really are serious on leaving no one behind, we have to reach first the ones who've been left furthest behind. But we are aligned with the SDGs, with the Agenda 2030, but we decided to commit ourselves into what we call three transformative results. And you have them there on our slide. It's the 3 zeros, as we call them, is 0 unmet need for family planning, 0 maternal death, and 0 violence and harmful practices against women and girls. They are very bold, we know that, and we are very aware that in 2030, when the international community, when the people to whom we serve calls upon our responsibility to deliver on them, we know that's kind of not going to be easy, but we are still very keen on focusing on these results. So we lead with a purpose, and this was the goal of showing you this. We promote rights, safety, and dignity. We advance equality. We leave no one behind, but we do it with our partners. And we've considered 3 special categories of partners, if I can say so. This is also a methodology attempt to organize or to make it more understandable how we work in partnerships. We work with governments, we work with the public, and we work with the private sector. I'm going to show you our metrics. This is how we look to partnerships. We have our mission, as I've told you, deliver a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. We have our 3 transformative results, and we have our engagement theme. If you look to each one of our transformative results, you will see that we engage to deliver on that results on specific themes. And we position UNFPA into each one of those clusters. If you are looking at how we achieve the 0 maternal deaths, it means we engage mainly into safe birth, and we position ourselves as being very clear that every woman has the right to a safe pregnancy and to a safe childbirth. The role of UNFPA, as you know, is to empower. It's to empower people to manage their sexual and reproductive health. It's to promote and protect the health of women during pregnancy and childbirth, and also to enable women and girls to fulfill their potential by preventing and tackling abuse against them. And we do it through 4 types of strategic partnerships, and they are fully aligned with our new strategic plan, as Marilena has mentioned, and I think most of you are aware of it. Since the adoption of the last strategic plan of UNFPA, UNDP, UNICEF, and Win Women, we share a common chapter, which means that we share an approach and we plan together, we deliver together but differently, and we need to report together. And this is something that it's clearly aligned on also on the way we do our partnerships. Of course, that we also have to have some precautionary principles. As we were just saying, some of our agencies are actually considered brands, and we have to be careful when it comes to mitigate all reputational risks and also the misuse of UN symbols, and that's something very interesting for us. As it was mentioned, sometimes one bad partnership is what it takes. But let me just call your attention to these 4 types of partnerships that we have. We call them the REACH partnerships, the resource mobilization partnerships, and the brain power partnerships, and also what we call alliances for conducive environment. As we know, and it's been discussed here, it's not only about money. Partnerships are also a way are also relevant to position UNFPA, to position our mandate. And you have here a couple of examples on how we do it. When it comes to the partnerships we call REACH, of course it has to do with increasing visibility, with increasing impact, with engaging academia, scientific institutions, multi-stakeholder initiatives, civil society. When we talk about resource mobilization, of course, we are talking about how to attract resources for UNFPA's programs and initiatives. And then we are talking about corporations, foundations, high net worth individuals and their foundations, individuals and then civil society. When it talks about brain power, we are more focused on innovation. We are more focused on how we can overcome the bottlenecks that prevent us from delivering in these scenarios. And when we talk about alliances for conducive environment, we are talking about partnerships with parliamentarians, with civil society that help us to overcome what we call non-conducive environments and to leverage on civil society. I think I'm coming to an end. I'm just going to show 3 slides of partnerships. One of them is what we call the Safe Birth Even Here campaign. It's what we call a REACH partnership. It's a partnership where we tried to first call the attention of the international community that even in humanitarian settings, women still get pregnant, they give birth, and even in these settings, safe birth has to be one of our priorities. This is one of the campaigns. Sorry. Another one of the campaigns is what we call the baby box. We launched this baby box project to allow mothers to protect their infants in harsh situations. It's also one of the REACH partnerships. And I'm going to skip to the last partnership I have here because I have a vested interest on this, I must admit. It's what we call alliances for conducive environment. I've joined UNFPA 1 year ago, and before I joined UNFPA, I was a parliamentarian. It was one of the things I did before. And so I can vouch here in front of you that these types of partnerships, they really work. The way UNFPA works with civil society, the way UNFPA works with parliamentarians in order to create what we call, and I've mentioned this before, the conducive environment for the resource mobilization, but also for the implementation of ICPD. We work through networks, we work with parliamentarians, and we leverage the work of parliamentarians by providing them with all the information they may want, with showing them what works in different scenarios, but also in comparative scenarios. And this is going back to the beginning. It's not only about money, it's about positioning UNFPA, it's about showing the relevance of the organization, it's about showing the relevance of our work. And of course, we know that this means tailored actions. There's not one size that fits all. You cannot design a partnership and think it can be applied everywhere in every context. And also, this requires a strong process for due diligence, for brand reputation, and it's one of the areas that the document that the Joint Inspection Unit has produced has a clear call for joint action for system-wide approach. And we thank you for your kind attention, and I hope that this is just the first of many initiatives where UN agencies can sit together and learn from each other and also take home some good examples on how to work with the private sector, because there's not enough people and there's not enough resources to deliver for the 2030 agenda. We need to be innovative and we need to call everyone to the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica, for sharing your institutional experience. It is indeed very interesting to see how the emphasis have changed in matters related to democracy since the event I mentioned in 1964 when UNFPA did not actually exist, but the issues were on the agenda of the United Nations. And thank you also for your last remark that we need more of such meetings, interagency. It is not me who said it, but you implies that actually we don't have to often the occasion to be together in such setting. We have here on the podium one quarter of the United Nations Joint Inspection Unit, the participating organizations, but of course we had others in other sessions. So we move now to a different world, the world of the atom. I give the floor to Andy Garner, the Laboratory Coordinator, Department of Nuclear Sciences and Application in the International Atomic Energy Agency. Sorry?
Have an interaction?
Yes,
and,
we will after. Yes,
discussion,
definitely.
Because it's almost 11 o'clock.
We have to hear first the panelists, and we'll have an occasion to speak, and you'll be the first one to be asked to the floor. Yes, we started 10 minutes later. We will kindly ask for your indulgence. Please, Mr. Garner.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Petru, and I noticed you didn't introduce the IAEA as rich and famous, and that's probably because, we're not rich, and if we're famous, it's not for things related to the topic of this meeting. I appreciate that you've added me to given me the slot to join this discussion today. I'm going to focus on three things, and I'll try to be quite brief. First of all, I will be talking about the perspective from a science and technology organization. I'll be talking about how we've always worked with the private sector. We've always had to work with the private sector to fulfill our mandate, how that's changing, and both in how we work with them directly, but why we need them for delivering impact. I'll give a couple of examples. I also like to say I'm different than most of the panelists in that I'm not heading a partnerships resource mobilization group or involved in that. I have colleagues here, Laura, who's in a similar group. I have from our office of the IAEA Geneva office here. If you're interested in the nuclear watchdog function, I also have an expert in the whole private sector vetting and preparation perspective. Most people know the IAEA for its watchdog function. The nuclear watchdog function, you know our inspectors, you know we're in the news about what's going on around the world with nuclear material. However, few realize that we actually have a large range of activities dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of our 170 member states would probably tell you that a main reason they are a member of our organization that's growing is because of these activities related to food and agriculture, human health, water and environment, industrial applications. I'm different in the sense I coordinate laboratories. The IAEA is also, I think, the only UN organization with research laboratories. We have 12 related to the Sustainable Development Goals based in Monaco, Vienna, and outside of Vienna in a place called Cybersdorf. Unfortunately, I'm based in Cybersdorf and not Monaco, but we are well positioned to provide scientific support to our member states. I'll give you an example. One of our main areas of activity is enhancing our member states' capabilities to use radiotherapy, radiation medicine to treat cancer or nuclear medicine to diagnose and assess diseases such as cardiovascular illness. In our efforts to enhance working with the private sector, we actually use the term non-traditional partners because all that we do in terms of establishing the vetting process, assessing risk, we apply also to partners such as foundations and other institutions that are not member state governments. And that's changing, and I'll speak about that in a moment. I'd just like to focus on a couple of examples, and the first thing I'd like to point out is that we've traditionally worked with government scientific institutions. In fact, we have networks of such institutions around the world. Examples would be we have a large network of laboratories that analyze environmental radioactivity in oceans and in terrestrial environments or in foodstuffs. With 140 member states, over 200 labs. We have a joint lab network with WHO to assure the quality of radiotherapy in hospitals. and we have a growing network of veterinary laboratories for diagnosing animal diseases, increasingly transboundary animal diseases, and fostering animal production health. What we're finding is there's a trend towards privatization of some of the scientific institutions. In fact, we share a site with the former Austrian National Laboratory, which has been recently privatized. And that is also one of the challenges that we face, that our partners who we've worked with, required to be government institutions, are increasingly entering a gray area of public and private. The interest with the private sector has grown in the last years, and I think the reason for that is that we need each other. Our technology that we're working in is very much equipment and instrumentation driven, and in fostering innovation is often fostering developments in instrumentation. Let me just give you one example in our area of work. We have, and I think the UNEP director yesterday talked about their private sector partnerships really originating via entrepreneurships and entrepreneurial activities, and I think that would be classified in the IAEA as an entrepreneurial area. We have a large initiative to renovate and expand our laboratories to meet our member states. And we have had several partnerships with equipment manufacturers in the last 2 years. One example is last year we signed an agreement with a large medical equipment manufacturer to provide a 10-year loan of a medical linear accelerator. These typically sell for around 3 to 4 million euro, so that we can help provide service to our member states in terms of setting standards, training their experts that are working in cancer control. And this is truly a case where, using the term yesterday, we identified some shared value. For us, we have the technology to help member states provide safe treatment, and for the equipment manufacturer, they're able to be exposed to our network around the world and learn about new standards, dosimetry protocols, etc. What we've also learned, though, it's not just about the equipment. We both have the goal of treating more patients safely and effectively for cancer in the long term. So they also, we have learned, have the interest that treatment, if they sell equipment, is actually effective in the long term. And so we see that there are possibilities to expand the partnership both for training and for developing further more appropriate technologies that are more suitable for a developing world context. So in this case, it's not just about resource mobilization. We've heard that repeatedly. It's about how we can both help meet our missions. An interesting thing that I've learned from that experience, I haven't heard in this meeting, is we've talked a lot about reputational risk for the organizations. We've learned that's also a concern for companies. They're also looking at their reputational risk. What would they? It could be about the brand, and certainly if a company's going to work with us, they have to think about, well, the International Atomic Energy Agency. How does that help them? But moreover, could they be perceived as trying to influence or steer or divert the organization from its purpose? We've also had to work with their own vetting processes, with their compliance offices, and so it's very much like a dance. Looking ahead, we see challenges. If we're trying to foster innovation, we've heard this yesterday from those from science parks, technology parks. We'll have to work with the private sector, with non-traditional partners. We're looking now at how we can include them as equal partners in our research projects. We're also have been trying. We've had an attempt to have challenges or to encourage by putting out a bottleneck in a certain technological area. An example I'll give you is we work increasingly in food traceability, being able to trace back the origin of food or the authentication or the origin of contamination. using isotopic techniques, how could we challenge companies to develop instrumentation that would be also suitable in a developing world context? Or how can we challenge them to provide radiotherapy machines that work off the grid with less smaller requirements for training? We've also heard a lot about transparency and fairness. It's been a big issue also in our Board of Governors that they want all companies from all member states. Companies usually come from certain countries, so we found our member states are interested that we give equal access to their companies. In order to address that, we have launched an initiative for all our upcoming equipment and technology needs in the frame of this project that I have spoken about on the UN Global Marketplace. So if you were to go to the UN Global Marketplace today, you would find our call for an expression of interest for partners for the equipment and some technological areas. So this is the first time we've tried that as a way to foster discussions on how we could work together. And it is a challenge because of this procurement partnership fork in the road it's not always so clear which path to take. I think I will stop there. As I said, I have the perspective of pushing our organization. We have also the challenge that a big part of our mandate, we don't need the private sector for inspecting nuclear materials around the world, but we need it for the other half of our mandate. That also is a challenge for an organization. It tends to make us more cautious and slow in terms of coming up with approaches. I'd like to finish by also thanking the Joint Inspection Unit and the World Association for Sustainable Development for this chance to share experiences. I think that we often lack examples of success stories and how to do this. And I'm always surprised when I come to meetings and talk to my colleagues and find we're all trying to figure out the same thing. A difference between procurement and partnerships or appropriate vetting or risk assessment. And so I think the further sharing of these experiences and also the failures, what hasn't worked, would be very helpful in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, I'll pass to the interactive discussion. I would kindly invite colleagues to ask questions, but of course, a matter of priority. Madam, thank you for coming. Thank you for understanding. We had more speakers than the average of the panel, so we had to allocate more time. You may ask your question. Please be concise and address the question to specific panelists if possible. Thank you.
I just came back. I have another obligation. My name is Gerry Report and I'm from the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. I came to this event to learn about how to reposition the UN system. And what I heard is only the what's and the how's of separate organizations and agencies. If you would have so many people around the table, you could have organized a meeting here without audience. Because if you organize something with audience, please next time think about interaction. We are here to share and to learn and not only to listen. And now it's running out of time. It's not only because of security, because 10 minutes later start, okay, then you redress a little bit the contribution of the panelists in order to have the interaction with the room. But my suggestion is, please, you have written an interesting report. I went through the recommendations. They make sense, but they have to be discussed on the how. And there is a desperate need for the UN to consider a new approach, a joint approach on how to deal with partnerships. And it's not dealt with here, and that's a missed opportunity. And I have to tell you, I'm quite frank, but I'm very disappointed. And I have another obligation, so I have to leave the room. One of the organizers was begging me to come back to share this, so I've said it. I'm disappointed, and we need discussions on the how to reposition the UN system and not about the experiences of organizations. Yeah, but I have no time, sorry. I have other obligations.
Thank you, Madam. Points well taken. Apologize. I give the floor to the next intervenant. Simona, please have the floor. You ask for it.
I represent the UN System Staff College, and in fact my question is going a little bit in a similar direction as the previous speaker was just asking. In fact, today and tomorrow, member states under the guidance of Algeria and Denmark are discussing the resolution on repositioning the UN development system, and two of the recommendations that seem to be in the making in the resolution are around ways to ensure that entity-specific thematic funds complement UN core funding, and that partnership capacities of the different entities would be pooled together. So I was in fact wondering, we've now heard a lot about entity-specific approaches to private sector partnerships. Just maybe a quick feedback on your side on what are the discussions in each of the entities, very briefly, in terms of opening the partnerships that you are having to others within the UN system. And I think we've heard from several of you the being rich and being famous became sort of a threat, and that's part of the problem, because of course somehow within the UN we need to be a little jealous of our partnerships, because every specific entity has its own mechanisms and needs to be seen and needs to be visible. And I'm just wondering, what are the discussions? We know the direction of travel is a different one. We need to be able to bring it all together. Where do you stand, maybe each one very quickly, when you see those recommendations of the repositioning report of the Secretary General and the discussions among member states? If asked, are you ready to open, and how, and what are the concrete approaches? In 2 sentences each one, if that was possible. Thank you.
Timur, I think I will take 1 or 2 other questions, and then I will give the floor to the panelists to respond to those questions and briefly to your comment. Who else wants to ask? Okay, please have the floor, sir. Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mohammed. I'm a postgraduate student. Thank you for the having this important event, and my sincere thanks for the organizers of the event and for the panel as well. My question was basically to the panel, and that was in regard to the different approaches and different topics being discussed. But my point is about 2 different aspects of the actions all being taken here. And I think if I take the example of the projects that is taken, like the one in Ethiopia, in a way to increase the potentials of the people to be more productive, and all to the other examples as well, I think there are 2 dimensions to these different actions, and the one of them is, I think, is in a way, how do you pave the ground with the systems of the governments in place to make these things happen. Secondly, you need to spread the knowledge for these communities in order to understand how important all these things are to these and the benefit to the community. So my question is how knowledge was shared in a way that people would understand the need to be implementing those things. And are you involved in spreading the knowledge about these approaches, or is it just solely on the part of the partnership that you're involving with? Thank you.
Thank you very much. WFP, are you sure your colleague is here? Okay, please.
Yes, but I'm the head of global partnerships in the private partnership division, so I'd like to say something if I may. I am very happy Bernhard's here. He's a great partner for us as well. What I do think is interesting, again, is this idea that we're talking about repositioning the UN, and I question how much we talked about repositioning the UN. The gentleman from ITU, I feel your pain, the love triangle. We live within the love triangle every day when it comes to partnerships with the private sector. And I do want to go back to that. And I said, while we have these examples here, what I'd be interested in hearing is that we're seeing a lot of companies being less interested in cash. Partnerships are not free. There are direct and indirect support costs in order to implement those partnerships. And the very truth of the matter is they're moving towards shared value. We heard that discussion of shared value yesterday, but shared value is not philanthropy, it is not CSR, it is a business proposition. And it is a business proposition actually to address a social good, but make money. And this is actually where the UN is behind, particularly in our rules, and what we're facing more and more today. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, actually, Mr. Clark, about the idea of co-creation, who owns IP, et cetera. And it's very clear that this is what companies want when they're working in partnership. And basically, a lot of our colleagues in the NGO space have more room to work in this way. So I think it's something that as the UN we're going to have to tackle, and yet we're still kind of tinkering around on just the basics of partnerships, but even partnerships and innovations are moving more quickly in the partnership space as well, and I think it's something that we should look to address, just as a comment.
Thank you very much. I don't dare to invite other interveners to take the floor because we have two fundamental questions that are addressed to all panelists. So what I should do is indeed to invite the panelists to make their final comment in response to the two issues raised by Simona and on knowledge sharing. So I start in the same order. Bernhard?
Yeah, for the sake of time efficiency, let me answer just the first question. If the panel for the second isn't sufficient, I'll come back to that. But just for the first one, opening it up, I think you do need to consider two perspectives. One is your own, one is the perspective of the partner, and we don't have private sector people here on the panel right now, so I think we should also ask them. On the internal side, my colleague Sandy mentioned, like, you do need management support, like opening up all the partnerships. You do need to actually put effort and time investment and also management support, because a lot of these partnerships, you also as an organization need to be committed, and it has to address your needs. So I think that it's not as simple as saying, well, now everybody just takes everybody's partnerships, because then, well, you also need to invest time. From the perspective of the private sector company, they also have needs. I mean, now we should have them speak. I would say, from my experience, they have needs because they usually care about a specific cause. It's not that you can randomly exchange like hunger with children, with animal rights. The other thing is they also have like visibility demands. So they want to have pictures, they want to have stories and all of that, where I think if we talk about, like, we do need to talk about specifics. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for the point about the pooled partnership capacities, and I think due diligence is a good example of that with UN Global Compact. I learned a lot, and we're benefiting as an organization from that, learning for how the other organizations are dealing with due diligence. I wanted to mention, thanks for the point about shared value. I think this is where the pressure we're getting from the private sector is to move into these new ways of working, and we're simply not equipped for it. That was the point that I made earlier. And it goes also, I mean, frankly, we're set up for fundraising usually. So we hire a whole bunch of people to go out and raise a bunch of money, and then you get a bunch of people to implement projects. And more the companies don't want to work that way. They don't want to pay you administrative charges for project implementation. So that's a big challenge for the organizations that are focused on, that are largely fundraising organizations, I have to say. And that model has to be rethought. And it also goes back to project versus impact. I think a lot of the companies don't care about the project per se. They want to be able to say how many people's lives were changed at the end. How was a market created where it didn't exist before? Is water now available in 50 communities? And is it sustainable after? So I think we need to listen to the private sector. We don't need to flip ourselves upside down and suddenly just open the floodgates. And, you know, we have certain responsibilities, but the way we work could change. And I'm hoping that this group will help us get there.
Thank you. Marina?
So perhaps to answer the first comment that we got, I actually think the Gerry Report is what the road ahead. So in some ways, I actually think we have the answer. The question is just what are the next steps and what can we do to support this? And I think if we achieve most of the recommendations, we're already a long way ahead. On the shared values and the pooled funds, there already are some very good examples where the private sector is actually contributing to the joint programming modalities. So joint programs set up by several UN agencies in the development context, and the private sector is actually contributing to that. We are promoting something similar in another country where we have a country-based pooled fund. So I think we have seen baby steps on this. Can more be done? Absolutely. I was looking at the recommendation of the UN Development System report, which was actually about the resident coordinator having sufficient capacity for strategic partnerships. I mean, honestly, at this point, at this juncture, are we ready to pool our partnership approaches from all agencies into one system? No, I don't think so. But can we actually build on some of the good practices that we already have, the pooled funds being one, the strengthening of the resident coordinator, the looking at how we can do this at country level? I think this is where the great potential lies. And essentially, I think some private partnerships will always be individual relationships between an agency and a private sector partner. We have to be realistic, but it's also about brand alignment and other issues. And I say this as OCHA, where we promote collective approaches to partnerships, and most of our partnerships are actually for the collective good. But I think there is a reality that some of these are individualized, and I think will always be the case. But can be more done on the collective? Absolutely.
Virpi?
Yes, so first on the operational level, UNIDO's role in this partnership is the technology transfer. So normally the private sector has the technology and UNIDO shares this technology in the communities and so forth. On the kind of strategic level, we have multi-stakeholder platforms which are open, and we have participants from other UN agencies, and it has already happened that a private sector partner that UNIDO originally worked with goes ahead with another UN agency in a different country or in a different location.
Thank you, Marilena.
Yes. And I will address the question on how agencies are specifically looking at the reform process and how at the partnership. So we know that the UN reform is in process, and as UNICEF, we are basically on a daily basis involved in the, as I say, it's a process led by member states with the Secretary General, and but we are actively supporting that process. And there are three, maybe just to summarize so that everybody knows also what we are talking about, there are three key elements in this UN reform system discussions. The first one is the more integrated and tailored support to the 2030 agenda. And I think today we have given some examples of what does it mean for us. But in that regard, we are really discussing how we can be a best player, especially at the country level, because this is where the reform will have a very big impact, including in terms of partnerships through the UNDAPs, the Development Assistance Frameworks, which probably will also get a different name, and how we can align the capacities, our resources, for that purpose. The second element is the enhanced accountability and reporting and oversight. This is a second pillar of the UN reform being discussed, and Monica mentioned, and I also refer to the common chapter of the 4 agencies with a common board, and we have started the common reporting, the common issues. The SDG results tracking is also what will align us, because we have to be concrete also in enhancing this system and working together, knowing that the discussions, for instance, on the UNDGs, on DOCO, on the RCs at the field are still taking place, and that it will be a key role that we will also need to support, that we are already supporting. I mean, I've been myself 18 years in the field and quite involved in UN country level discussions, but we need to take it now across all the levels, global, regional, and country level, and also to show how we can build this advocacy and coherence, of course, with the member states who are leading the process. And the third element of the reform is increased efficiencies. And I think we have covered that today through also technologies, programs, initiatives, and to go back to the panel, with the role of the private sector, we can indeed have efficiencies. I say I have many examples here that we didn't have time to share, but we will be happy to discuss with any of you. I'm also here with 2 of my key colleagues working in the specific division of private fundraising and private-public partnerships. But again, strengthening efficiencies will be critical, and I think today we have given some examples, but of course it's a very important discussion that is evolving, and we will see how also the final deliberations made by the member states in the huge consultative process will do, and we fully support that.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica.
I think most of the interesting things have been said. I would refer you to the Joint Inspection Unit report. There's a clear call for coherence, for system-wide actions, for the revision of the guidelines, which is in the end what we tried here to show. Each one of us tried to show how our agencies are repositioning themselves in order to deliver for the 2030 agenda. And of course, as Marina was saying, we will never have the same partnerships for all agencies. Some of them are actually going to be even more tailored according to the specific commitments that we do in our strategic plan. But I think there's a clear platform, as Marilena was mentioning, to share more, because we need to deliver together. We deliver for the same people. No matter how targeted your organization is, in the end, we all deliver for the same people. So I think there's this call for system-wide action goes very much into the SDGs state of mind or framework. And of course, we cannot do that without sharing knowledge. That's why the role of academia is so relevant here in this conference.
Thank you. Last and most concise, Andy.
I'm good to say I agree with everybody, but I think this process is part of the repositioning. I appreciate...
Microphone.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with colleagues. I think we're repositioning both as an organization. We are trying to determine the value. We also have to convince our own member states that they want us to do this. And I think the report and fora like this are ways to help us learn from each other and position. It may not be all at one time, but in the general thrust forward. I also would appreciate, and I mentioned in my remarks about shared value. I think it really comes down to impact and being able to convince our beneficiaries that this approach is going to enhance impact. So we need to bring also member states and recipients into wanting us to move this way. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my turn to be very concise. So I think we leave the table after 7 very good meals, and we're still hungry, which means that we should continue the dialogue with our colleagues in the system. Thank you very much, the panelists, for the treasury history.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.